understand exactly what the county council had bought in terms of the site and liabilities, looking at services and all sorts. And since probably 2009, there's been an active programme of archaeological research into the site that over the last decade or 8 years or so has been heavily geared towards engaging with the public. I work as an archaeology consultant now, which means I go around giving my advice to developers and spend a lot of my life in quarries. And the big problem with archaeology in those locations is very difficult to get the public involved or engaged in archaeology. Something I actually feel very strongly about is that people should be able to have a go. So we have on this site an opportunity, a chance to actually engage with the broader public and get them out on site, get them to have a chance to be their very own Indiana Jones, for want of a better term. Notice I don't mention a certain other television program about archaeology, whose name I will not mention. Archaeology is one of those things that I've been doing since I was a teenager. I discovered it when I was still at school, and as a result, I used to go into school, register in the morning, and then go off and dig. So it's something I've always loved doing, and I enjoy sharing that enthusiasm and seeing the excitement people get from doing it. Now, on the Roman town at Irchester, we've carried out a whole series of excavations. What I want to do is go gently through the information we actually have of the site, and show you. Now I need to try and work out how to share screen. Share screen, and hopefully that's working. Right. On this site, we have the opportunity to give people a chance to have a go, but it's also a site that's a special site. It's protected by law as a scheduled ancient monument. It's a site that contains a microcosm, really, of Northamptonshire's history. Ranging from early prehistoric, as reflected by small scatters of flints, through the Iron Age, a series of Middle Iron Age farmsteads. There's late Iron Age activity. There's, of course, the huge amount of Roman activity there. And there's also the remains of a medieval village and then a post-medieval gentleman's farm. So on one site, we have little bits of the whole of the county's history. And that was why when the council first acquired it, their view was this was a heritage asset that needed to be opened up to the public in order to make Northamptonshire a destination as opposed to a county one drives through. So that's the sort of starting point of the site. Now, obviously, you'll know where Wellingborough is, just and Irchester is just slightly to the west of it. This is the site. It's almost the lungs of the area. It's one of the few large green spaces that are left, especially with the way that solar farms and housing development are going. Anyway, what do we know about the site? The site was looked at by antiquarians and archaeologists for probably a couple of 100 years. It was known, certainly from sort of 17th century onwards, as the site of a Roman occupation. Rather amusingly, given the period in which it was talked about in the 18th century, the view was this was the summer camp for the Romans, that their main site was in Irchester village, and they used to come here in the summer for the summer holidays to get the fine airs from the valley. I think that was really a reflection of the development of seasides and spa towns. They sort of extrapolated it back and imagined the Romans did the same. But anyway, as a site, it was heavily examined in the 19th century by the Reverend Baker from Hargrave. He dug various parts of the site. He poked holes in it. He had an early form of geophysics. A friend of his, a man called Fairless Barber, would wander around the site with a metal rod and a hammer, banging it into the ground. And wherever they hit anything hard and solid, the labourers, the workmen, would dig down. Because in those days, archaeology was not carried out by trained archaeologists. It was any labour that was spare from the agricultural economy or other areas that did the labouring, while the so-called gentlemen, intelligent people, in this case a clergyman, did the directing. So very much a sort of antiquarian approach. And what we've got here is a plan showing in red the areas that Baker dug and the wall outlines of some of the structures he examined. And you can see he focused on the defensive walls around it, one large area in the middle of the town, and a few of the buildings. He really didn't understand the site, and he used the models of the day to try and interpret what he'd got. And that was interesting to deal with. Sadly, the fines went off the four corners of Great Britain, and one of the parts of the project that we carried out in 2004 for the council was to try and find where these fines have gone. And sadly, it would appear that most of them has just sort of dissipated into various museum collections, making it impossible to really reconstruct exactly what Baker found. Now, with the improvements in science and technology available to archaeologists, from really the mid-90s right the way through to 2009, 2010, areas of the site were subjected to geophysical survey, particularly magnetometry. Magnetometry measures minute variations in the ground's magnetic field in units called nanoteslas, a sign of how sensitive a magnetometer is. On one site I was working, we were using a magnetometer, and it picked up a train going by over a mile away. And you can actually see the magnetic field rise and fall as the train went past. But anyway, from this you can see a whole series of dark lines and light lines, and they are reflecting a whole series of buried remains that you can't see by any other means. Now, I think you can see my cursor, the little white arrow. In this area we have a square, which is the remains of a Middle Iron Age farm. There is a further Middle Iron Age farm just over in this area. There's the remains of a buried river channel here, a paleo channel, which is the remains of the river that on an 18th century map is called the River Nine, not Neen, not Nen, but Nine. We're looking for the rivers 10, 11 and 12. Now, in terms of the actual site itself, the main focus obviously is this area here, where we have the walled area. Within which there are a series of square and rectangular buildings, and running out from it we have a road coming out in this direction and a further road going out in this direction, heading towards Higham Ferrers. There are further roads that link into this town that adjoin in some of the nearby fields, and we have the main north-south route coming down here, running in a valley between the walled area and the very extensive eastern suburbs. Now, the walled area contains a whole series of buildings that probably include workshops, include temples. If you look in this area, you can see a square and a circular building. And there's a further square and a circular building there. They are the remains of temple complexes to gods, the names of which we do not know. There are a series of strip buildings around these roads here, quite small strip buildings, probably the remains of shops, workshops, and things like that. Possibly one or two of them maybe to provide hot food. In this part of the town, we have a number of larger buildings. I'll describe this as the sort of posh cul-de-sac, and I'll explain why I say that in a minute. And then further buildings here, which this looks like it's probably the Roman bathhouse. The people of Roman Irchester obviously need to get clean. And then there's a further structure in here about which I'll talk in a little while, called a mansio. So we've started to develop an understanding of some of the buildings in the town, and we can even start telling the story of some of the buildings. This structure here, with very black outline for the walls, almost certainly burnt down. And what I was saying earlier about the minute levels of magnetism, what happened is as the building burnt down and cooled down, it fixed itself on the contemporary magnetic North Pole. So it had an enhanced reading. Now, the magnetometry unravelled certain questions of the site as well. It was probably one of the more exciting things regarding the project was when we started to look at it, what we could see was a very faint outline just coming here and going off there with a slight playing card corner just about there. And we think this is actually the remains of a Roman fort, a small Roman camp, which probably was established shortly after the conquest and was established with one very simple aim, and that's to control the river crossing. At this point, the river lies in a very wide valley, a valley in excess of 1 kilometre wide. And at that stage, the river was almost certainly made of a series of shallow channels, braided watercourses that would be easy to paddle across, a ford. And I think, so therefore, this town is located, and this fort is located at an all year round river crossing. Now you can see the road coming down, and this is the valley floor, and this lighter streak here is the remains of a causeway on the opposite side of the valley, which extends under the railway line and beyond. That was looked at in previous gravel extraction by the Oxford unit. Now, why is this significant? Well, elsewhere, if you look at the relationship with the valley side, you either have a very steep scarp, something that isn't present here. There is a little dry valley that runs right the way down onto the floodplain, or the valley floor is much narrower and therefore the channels are deeper. So here we have somewhere that gave the ideal location for A, getting down onto the valley floor, and B, crossing the channel with a hop, skip and a jump and probably a towel for your feet at the other end. So this was somewhere that would have been used throughout antiquity, not just by the Romans, but almost certainly by earlier prehistoric peoples. But the establishment of the fort was almost certainly there to manage, maintain and control that access. Now we think that that fort, that military occupation was probably abandoned following the suppression of the Boudiccan revolt in 60-61 AD, when the soldiers will have moved north to Leicester and Lincoln and beyond. But I think it's a sign of how significant this location is in the Roman world. Now, in terms of the site, we have a whole series of roads. Now, those of you who, like me, grew up with the Ladybird Book of Roman Britain will remember that great thing that Roman roads are always straight. If you look at the Roman roads within this walled area, the one thing they significantly are not is straight. They are the most curly-whirly roads in the world. And there's a very simple reason for that. The ground slopes from south to north. The ground also slopes to the east and to the west. The walled area of the town sits on this saddle of ground. And I think this curving dendritic form to the roads is actually a way of draining the town centre, getting rid of the water from the road networks and also whatever fluids came from the buildings, and I'll leave you to imagine what those fluids might be. It's enabled them to drain away, so you'd avoid the smells and the impurities and bugs that you might get if that wasn't possible. Now, in the case of Irchester, we have a road network which is actually very, very similar to a number of other towns. Now, if one looks at the roads here, we have the main road down in this valley coming straight past. This is the main north-south road. And one of the things that we have within this town is there is no real evidence for a north or a south gate, because of course they wouldn't have been necessary. If the main road running north-south runs past the walled area, there is no benefit having a north-south gate. If they had put a north gate in, it would actually have opened on a scarp where they'd fallen down quite a steep slope. There is no south gate, but what we think we have in the road network is a D-shaped loop that comes out round here, and joins this main road. So essentially a looping route with the main road at the bottom. And interesting, when you look at other Roman towns in the valley, Titchmarsh, you again have a main route with a loop of roads coming off it, and Ashton, you have a main route again with a loop running off it. I think it's one of those interesting things that clearly here we have the origins of the bypass, with a main route going through with structures along it, but a series of other structures, probably more residential, more desirably domestic, on this looping side road. And it's that looping side road that we have the town wall around. Now, the looping side road goes around the wall and encloses buildings that are already there. It's important you realise that the wall was erected probably sometime in the latter part of the 2nd century, and it's dropped like a hoopla ring on an already existing site. So there are buildings like this little building down at the bottom edge that's cut through by the defensive circuit. And we found also from our excavations a further building that's cut through by this defensive line. So we have a town with a bypass. Nothing new in life. The reason I don't think that there is a gate on the south side is this is the area that Baker said there was a gateway, but in the work done by David Hall and Nickerson in the 60s, when the road was improved, there was absolutely no sign of a Roman road in that area. But what we did find, or what they found, were buildings and structures that were flanking on what would have been the course of this looping road. You can see how this building's at a slight slew. And I think that this is further evidence to support what I'm saying about this looping road being the core of this settlement. Now, where does Irchester sit in the whole road network? Well, in many ways, it's a middling town. It's in the middle of the valley. Toaster's a large walled town. Duston's a funny little village of a Roman site. Kettering much the same. Titchmarsh much the same. Ashton's a bit bigger than Titchmarsh and Kettering, but again, it's not as big as Irchester. Of these, Irchester is the only one that has a walled circuit put around it. And I think that's partly a reflection of where it sits on this road network. It's a really hub location with north-south routes running from Bedfordshire, where I currently am sat, up to Kettering, where I'll be on Friday night. My life is one long rock and roll, along with other roads that run up and down the valley, linking other sites and settlements. So I think Irchester has a key pivotal point, and there's even a road running from Irchester heading towards Toaster, about 2 kilometres of which we explored in the quarries at Wollaston. So I think Irchester's a really good central place, and that's reflected to another degree by all the other aspects that suggest status there. Now, the wall around the town, we know a little bit about. We know it was still standing in places in the 17th century. There's accounts of the wall standing up and the stone being arranged in certain slightly ornamental ways. Recently, when the Prologis estate, when Claudius Way was constructed, they clipped the corner of the town defences again, exposing the foundations of the defensive circuit wall, but it only survives as a few courses high. I think that the large amounts of the stone have been incorporated within the farm buildings and also in the villages around. Next time you go around Irchester or Wellingborough, look at the old buildings. And one wonders how many of the bits of limestone that you might see have actually been stolen, or should we say repurposed and reused in the buildings. Now, Irchester as a town has defences, which makes it unusual by comparison with a lot of others. Now, what that means is it's actually possible to compare it with other small towns. And Irchester is, would you believe, number 13. It's about the middling size of towns with defences, of small towns with defences. The largest one, of course, is Water-Newton, down the road just north of Peterborough. Water-Newton is described as a small town, but it covers square kilometres. It's got the most enormous suburbs. And when you think the company that Irchester is in with, you know, Irchester is comparable to quite a lot of the towns. I mean, Bath, where I currently live, is not that much bigger, and there's big arguments about what the defensive circuit in Bath really is. And you know, you see the places that it's bigger. You know, Caister, Rochester, a number of these other sites, Manchester, are far smaller. I mean, look at the small size of Manchester. So I think Irchester is a middling sort of town in its defences, and in lots of ways it's a very good example of a Roman small town, and that's why as an archaeologist I'm very excited to be studying it. Now, Irchester also, compared to the other small towns in the valley, has produced things that they haven't got. They haven't produced statuary. At Irchester, this figure on the left-hand side of a male torso, presumably it was a complete person at one stage, or maybe a complete deity at some stage. This torso was discovered. There's also a tombstone to Anicius Saturninus, about which I'll talk in a little while. And there's also the capital from a column, a large Corinthian column, suggesting a building with some architectural grandeur from within the town. So I think Irchester is a town that was on the up, that the Roman conquest was a good thing for it and for the people who lived there. Now, within the town, we have a series of buildings. As I've said, this, which is a bathhouse, fits with really what you'd expect for life in a Roman town. People expect the Roman Britons to be clean, go and oil themselves using strigils and goodness knows what to scrape the stuff off. Following the Roman custom, they probably had hair pluckers there, getting rid of unnecessary hair. There's one poet who says he's not sure what the worst noise is, the hair pluckers touting for trade, or the screams and yelps of the people having it plucked out with tweezers. Frankly, if they started threatening me with that, I'd move to Germany. Anyway, in addition to the bathhouse, what we have is this building lurking in here, which is a series of small rooms. And these series of small rooms, I think, indicate the function of this building. We think it's possibly a mansio. A mansio is a sort of imperial travel lodge. If we have a town here that has some status with the imperial setup, the imperial sort of system, what you'd need is safe accommodation for officials, civil servants, and soldiers to stay in. And what they did is they organised a system with their road network of horse changing stations and mancios. The horse changing stations are about every 10 or 12 miles apart, and the mancios are about 30 miles apart. And what they provided was a means by which messengers could cover 30, 40, 50 miles in a day and have somewhere safe to stay overnight. Now, that I think is one of the key things as to this town's status. I think this is indicating that Irchester is actually linked into what is called the cursus publicus, the imperial communication system by which messengers would have come up and down the road. And I think that's where the ford across the river is one of the significant magnets to this site, this location. A mansio would look something like this. This is one from Catterick. A multi-room structure, have facilities, people to stay, safe yards in which merchants would be able to store their wares, and also it would provide a certain amount of Roman quality life. There'd almost certainly be hypercaust heated rooms. Now, why do we think we've got this? Well, we think it's possibly this whole status thing linked to the ford. But I think there's also another aspect to this site, and that goes back to this tombstone, a tombstone to Anicius Saturninus, who came to Irchester and died, presumably of natural causes, but one was never quite sure. But this tombstone was found in the 19th century, and he was a strator. Now, a strator is a civil servant with a very specific role. He was responsible for buying horses and remounts for the imperial mail. So this man would have been in Irchester buying horses. Now, you might not think of it, but the Nene Valley would have been an ideal place for raising substantial numbers of horses to replace mounts used in the mail service, used in the communication network. So I think when you look at the valley floor, it's worth considering just how many herds of horses may have been farmed by the local area. And Anicius would have been there to buy them. Now, when I showed you the geophysics, there is a slight bias, and there's always a bias in evidence in archaeology, and this is why you have to be very wary of certain television programs. This plan is very good at showing buildings, but there are big gaps, and I think some of those big gaps were probably occupied by timber structures. A lot of Roman buildings didn't have stone walls, they were little more than sheds. And I think that a large number of the population would have simply lived in these flimsier timber-founded buildings that didn't leave a trace that we found by using geophysics at all. Now, this square here is a temple. It was looked at in the 19th century by the Reverend Baker, and in the early 2000s, Historic England, who, because this site is a scheduled and therefore protected ancient monument, allowed us to carry out 2 limited excavations to assess the level of damage caused, first of all, by Baker, and secondly, by agriculture, since this site was actively ploughed up until the 1970s. So we opened up a site, a trench over the temple site. We found the central Keller, the Holy of Holies, in which there almost certainly had been a cult statue of the deity. We also recovered part of the ambulatory wall, which would have been for the covered walkway that surrounded it, part of the courtyard around the temple, also the wall that separated the temple from the main road to the east gate of the town, and part of a structure that you can interpret in a number of ways. One archaeologist would describe it as the temple, the priest's house. I've never really gone with that. I think it's a building in which the offerings may have been collected and retained for safekeeping. Now, we got that photograph in pre-drone days by hoisting a very expensive camera to the top of a very high pole, and this is me trying not to drop it. we still had these things, we've still managed to make it work, and I think you'll agree, the result is pretty spectacular. Now, what did we get from the temple site? We found no real objects because the Reverend Baker had cleaned it out. You can see there was a very shallow soil cover. It's only about 6 inches thick. We found this wall going around, separating the temple from the road. This is the road, and this is the gateway into the courtyard. We excavated areas of the courtyard and found it absolutely covered in oyster shells, and presumably a little bit like the reference to the merchants in the temple complex in the Bible. It's likely that people were here selling food, drink, and all sorts of things to worshippers coming in. But from my point of view, one of the more exciting things we found was this rather uninspiring looking rectangle of mortar on the ground. I think this is possibly the mortar at either the base of a statue, so there may have been a large statue here, or perhaps more likely it is where the altar was for sacrificing the animals. The last thing you'd want to do is to take a goat or something else into the small area of the cellar of the temple and try and cut its throat. You're more likely to get kicked to death. Most Roman temples, the altar was external, allowing the sacrifice of animals, cockerels, goats, or whatever outside and the blood to run down. So I think this mortar bed here is actually one of the more exciting, if one of the less interesting looking discoveries. What did we find of the Baker work? Well, interestingly, what we did find was the remains of one trouser button. So in the tradition of Victorian antiquarians, after they'd done their digging, they probably went and had a slap-up meal. So he burst his way out of his trousers. Anyway, just to give you a mental idea, this is what the temple probably looked like, with the central cellar, this higher part in which the priest would have been able to go, and an ambulatory around which worshippers may have been able to go, and in which there would almost certainly been points where they would have been able to make monetary offerings to the gods. Following our excavation, because it's a scheduled monument, we had to bury it. So we tucked it up with terram, buried it in soil, and if you visit the site today, you'd never know we were there. At the same time, there were travellers' horses all over the site, and an excavation was allowed by Historic England in this northeast corner of the site. You can see how the drinking trough has been eroded around. There's quite a substantial hollow. So we put a trench in here to go across the town defences. And here they are. As I said, they've been robbed down to nothing. It looks almost like a footpath. It's 1 stone thick of rubble and mortar. Any usable stones were taken away and reused elsewhere in buildings. But what you can see in this picture is this is the town wall. Sorry about that. This is the town wall here. With the ranging rod sat on it, and it cuts through a building. This wall is cut through, and like the one at that end, this building's cut through by the defences on the northern edge. You can also see my nemesis on this site, bunnies. They've gone down over 4 foot, so it's almost like we've got the warship down nuclear bunker. Now, subsequent excavations have approached the site in different ways. We've started work in the orchard when the Heritage Lottery grant was first being put together. And to support that, we opened up an area and we excavated it with that obvious choice for archaeological labour, children. Now, children are interesting because of their approach to archaeology. You tell them to come in old clothes, they come in designer trainers. You tell them they'll get dirty, they try and hover over the mud. Most of them have yet to master that technique. But what was interesting is they thoroughly engaged with the process. And what we tried to do was give them an opportunity to dig, to process finds, and also engage their minds with thinking about what the site had been like in the past. What was rather nice is one of the children that came and took part in the dig as part of the school group, a number of years came back bringing his parents when we had an open day. So I think reaching out to these groups when they're young actually has a real benefit, a real asset for making these people feel the site is theirs in a real way. Now, the excavations included areas with buildings. I know this isn't Pompeii, but trust me, these are 2 Roman buildings with hards. And what you can see from this plan is we had buildings, we had ditches, and we had parts of a side road. we were basically only able to clean and plan the site. We weren't able to do a great deal of excavation with the children. And these areas that were open then, we've reopened over the course of the years and are now steadily recording and excavating the remains. Now, we carried out an excavation following the one with the children with some students, which didn't go terribly well. They weren't terribly motivated, but what we found was we engaged with some of the local history societies, the Higham Ferrers Archaeology Group, for example, and we got a lot done. So subsequent seasons on the site have been excavated using pure volunteers, amateurs, members of the great British public, giving them a chance to have a go at excavation, teach them how to do it to a professional standard, and really just engage with the fun of it. So here we have our first season on site with a number of people, and we're great believers in doing things with minimal facilities. You can see we've got a gazebo for shelter. But we had people carrying out excavation, carrying out recording, and a number of the people that have taken part over the years have actually gone on to get careers in archaeology and earn a living from it. Now, the walled town is an obvious focus for the site, but have to remember that there is also very extensive suburban spread. The whole site, in fact, is also part of an even bigger landscape of countryside. People living in the town don't make a great deal. They don't grow foods and things like that. So they're heavily reliant on the surrounding countryside. And I'm lucky that I've excavated large parts of that surrounding countryside over the years ahead of gravel extraction. And what we know from places like the work at Wollaston is how we have a series of roads running through with farms spread along them, producing a variety of crops ranging from wheat, barley, peas, beans, honey, but also wine. Vineyards. At Wollaston, we've excavated the remains of 2 vineyards, and there are further vineyards known at Grendon, Earls Barton, and also just to the north of Wellingborough. So the area in the Rome period was an extensive viticultural landscape, producing gallons and gallons of white wine. My idea of heaven. Now, these agricultural communities would have paid their taxes and their dues within the town. Another role for the town as a sort of tax collection hub. They would also, as I said earlier, been responsible for getting things like the horses for this remounts. And what evidence have we got for it? Well, we're looking at the animal bone. There are a number of foals and things suggesting that horses were bred in the area. We have evidence also for haystacks, suggesting livestock being kept in large numbers through the winter. Instead of slaughtering them ahead of the winter, they were keeping them in these haystacks. And the evidence comes in the rather nice form of hundreds of beetles that were recovered from a well. These beetles live in plantains, and the only reason the environmental specialists could think that there would be a large number down one well is if they'd been harvested as part of cutting for a hay meadow, put in a haystack, hatched out, ran around in a farmyard and fell down the well and died. So I think we've got good evidence to suggest that there's horse raising going on. The vineyards from Wollaston were fascinating because what we had were parallel trenches. This is the Rolls Royce of viticultural cultivation. It's called pastinatio. It's the hardest way of doing it. And I think what we've got signs of here is our farmers around Wellingborough were looking at the most reliable way of growing the vines. They'll grow like a weed. Simply take a cutting, keep it wet, and it'll root. But to make sure their expensive plants took, they appear to have taken on pastinatio trenches where they put vines in with supporting trellises of posts. They almost certainly planted them with a certain amount of manure to give them a kick start. And in the case of the Wollaston vines, they were spaced at about 5 meters apart. And the reason for that spacing is almost certainly so the shadow of one row of vines didn't fall on the next row of vines, and the soil in between was kept bare. And the reason for keeping it bare is obviously as the sun shines, it warms the ground up. And then at night, that warmth is given off. You've all experienced patios giving off their heat in the night, like a night storage heater. Well, that would have enhanced further the sugar content of the grapes. Now, we have no evidence for where the grapes were pressed, but they may well have been pressed in Irchester or some of the farms around. And I've put this 17th century picture up just showing how little equipment you'd need to press grapes. The picture, you can see the little detail on the right-hand side where you have two men standing in a half butt, treading the grapes, and the grape juice being extracted and then poured into wooden barrels to ferment. I think that the wine here would have been white wine. It might not have been white wine that you'd want to drink now, but imagine that imported wine has been brought in around the French coast and up the English Channel on open boats, and then it's been jolted around on the Roman roads. You wonder how well it travelled. At least this wine didn't have to travel terribly far. Now, the other thing about Irchester that fascinates me is how it was provisioned within that bigger landscape, not just with foodstuffs, but with materials. And at Irchester, we've estimated our population within the town about 700, and I'm beginning increasingly to think that number is a little bit low. But 700 people would need huge amounts of firewood just to keep them going, just to keep them warm and just to enable them to cook. Now, there's been various maths done by other archaeologists looking at things like standard yield per hectare of wood and how much wood is consumed by your average adult in a less developed society. So, you know, if you work on these figures, you end up with a huge tonnage, and the huge tonnage itself then leads on to a huge acreage. And if we have a population of, say, 700 in Irchester, that would mean that we would need at least 2.8 square kilometres of cultivated, managed woodland. Now, that's not woodland they'd cut down and clean fell, but that's woodland that would be managed to produce firewood so that it would regenerate year on year. But, you know, some of the large blanks in the countryside may well have been those areas of woodland. Now, that doesn't take into account wood needed for building. It doesn't take into account wood needed for industry. That is just the wood so they could cook and keep themselves warm. So I think there's a huge area of study to look at and to work through in terms of, you know, what resources were used, what was utilised by the town. Now, in terms of the town, what we have is also a series of burial areas. There was one burial area in the area occupied by the Claudius Way car park. There's a burial area that was identified in Lime Avenue during the road improvements. There was a further burial area identified in the 19th century during ironstone extraction, and we've been excavating a further burial area within the orchard. Now, these four burial areas are traditionally described as late Roman, 4th century inhumation cemeteries. They include babies, children. They include a number of interesting adult burials, including this one with what was probably a trepanned skull. Presumably they had things like epilepsy or migraines, and they thought that by cutting a hole in the skull, that might alleviate the pain or the problems. In this instance, it didn't, it killed them. We also have burials that have been decapitated. This one had the head taken off and placed by its knees. Quite a standard pagan burial practice. But with all these burial areas, one of the questions is, are they all 4th century cemeteries? And for a long time, I've maintained that some of these cemetery areas may actually be sub-Roman. That is 5th century in date. And what we need to do going forward is to organise some radiocarbon dates in order that we can see whether these burials date to the 300s or the 400s AD. The area of the orchard has produced quite a regular cemetery, with burials lying with their heads to the west and their feet to the east. But there's always exceptions. Here's our decapitated one with his head to the north and his feet to the south. The number of babies and children found within this cemetery is unusual. Normally, infant burials, baby burials, don't feature within formal cemeteries, and that's one of the reasons I think this cemetery may actually be later. It may be this sub-Roman period. Now, having trained up some of the volunteers, we've carried out a whole series of works as part of the development, the redevelopment of the site, right the way through the planning process. So we had volunteers taking part in the original trial trenching, which enabled us to understand what the site had in store for us when the redevelopment commenced. We carried out excavations of pits and ditches, which produced bone hairpins, Roman spoons, bits of hexagonal glass bottles, and things like this small bit of bronze. There's a decimal penny, and you can see next to it a small piece of bronze about the size of a little fingernail. When I saw it, I thought it was just a nasty little Roman coin, but you can see that it's got an interlaced decoration. It's all little grooves and ridges. This interlaced decoration is an Anglo-Saxon design, and this piece is actually part of a saucer brooch of probably 6th century date. So here we have evidence that there is Saxon activity on the site. So this site starts to fill in yet more gaps in where we knew people were active on the site. Now, this is where we've been excavating in the orchard. We have opened up the lower garden at one stage, but all of this area has been subject to the redevelopment, and we've carried out all the archaeological recording in this area using volunteers, engaging with volunteers. So we've satisfied the Heritage Lottery Fund's desire for public engagement, and the work has been done to a very high standard. We've recovered the remains of wells, roads, ditches, pits. This is a Roman well in the foreground here. There were a series of tree pits related to the garden associated with the house, just where the people are working at the moment. We've had areas of Roman ironstone extraction, quite large amounts of it. We don't know if this was for smelting or for hardcore for a road. With the wells, we had to use a commercial unit to carry out the work for health and safety reasons, and also because Historic England weren't very happy for us to do them. So we excavated these using Oxford East, who came in and opened them and recorded the remains. But if you think we've excavated this area with volunteers, we've had some stunning finds. We've worked in snow, unlike Time Team. We found the remains of pottery kilns. We found the remains of malting ovens. We have evidence to suggest that tanning was going on in the area. We have evidence for Roman roads coming through, these metalled surfaces, the remains of Roman roads. And we have also got evidence in the lower garden for further parts of the suburb, including buildings, roads, pottery kilns, probably just ordinary shops, and a multi-room structure, a very large building with lots of rooms on it, probably a building of some status that sadly had been ploughed down to next to nothing now. But this one overlooks the road, and it overlooks a road junction. It's almost certainly a building that had pretensions of grandeur within it. And behind it, we had a very odd building with hearths and furnaces, which is associated with some droplets of bronze. That's probably the remains of a bronze workshop. So I think you've got to think of the suburb of the town, this eastern suburb of the town, as very industrial. Lots of smells, lots of noise, lots of industry. Now, Irchester, being in England, gives us the joys of the English weather to cope with. This is from 2 years ago, but I've got a picture from this year. It's almost exactly the same, where all the features just fill with water. The good thing is they do drain away eventually, and we are able to get on with excavating. Now, 2 years ago, we excavated with 5 University of Leicester students. The rest of the people were again members of the public, and we followed that model through this year, where during the second week of the excavation there were 11 members of the University of Leicester students, and again about 15, 16 members of the public taking part. So we're trying to have quite a mixed team on site, which makes quite a fun atmosphere. But you know, we've had people who have no prior experience at digging, and we let them loose with a trowel to see what they can find, but under supervision and direction. Now, this year we widened an excavation around this, which is a complex with a Roman building and also a post-medieval building. This site has bits of everything within it. Sorry. we go. Here you can see the Roman wall, the Roman road in the foreground, but here we have the post-medieval wall and this drain. I think this building is probably a stable or something similar. Certainly that's what this pitch stone floor would suggest. And within the drain, there was a 17th century coin, heavily corroded coin. So I think here we have a building that goes with the present farmhouse, but it's a building that was unknown. It doesn't appear on any of the maps or any of the documents that we're aware of at this stage. Now, the biggest excitement from this year's excavations, from my point of view, was the area along the southern part of the orchard, where we had an area of dragged limestone that had been ploughed off during the medieval period, but it overlay extensive areas of floor surface, presumably from within Roman buildings, floor surface and yards of buildings that fronted onto that road, the road between the east gate of the town and Higham Ferrers. And work on that will continue possibly this autumn, but if not this autumn, certainly in next summer's excavation, because it has huge potential for showing us the remains of further buildings on the site. Now, I get excited about little things. And the road network on this site is quite something. It's something we understand far better now than we ever did before. And in this area down here, we had a trench that we opened this year about there, about where my arrow is. And one of the questions was whether this east-west road here that ran out to Higham Ferrers originally extended right the way to the north-south road in the valley bottom or not. We didn't know, but we opened up this box, and what we have here is the edge of the Roman road and the roadside ditch. So it clearly did originally run right the way through. So what we can now say about our eastern suburb is the eastern suburb, unlike the area within the wall, was extremely regular and extremely planned. There were two east-west roads, one there and one here. And between them, there are a series of side roads. One here, one here, one here. And if I go further into the geophysics, one located there, suggesting that the suburb was arranged like the rungs of a ladder, with buildings on either side of these roads, little workshops, little homes and other buildings lurking along there. So this small area of limestone and rubble is a very exciting find. Now, the other thing that came out from this year's excavation that I don't have a picture of, but again was one of the most reassuring things, was I have maintained for a long time that although in 410 AD the Romans said, look to your own defences to the towns, people who lived within the walled area would not have disappeared. And for a number of generations, they may have eked out an existence, hoping that what to them probably felt like Brexit would come to an end. And I've maintained that we've probably got 5th century and potentially 6th century activity on the site. And one of the burials this year, unlike any of the other burials on the site, produced 2 glass beads. And these glass beads date to the late Roman or post-Roman period. And it was the burial of a child, so a child about 2 or 3 years old, that had been placed within the cemetery that possibly wore these beads on a necklace. So here we have again potential for checking with radiocarbon dating that we have got evidence of our post-Roman activity. Also, rather less exciting, but equally fun as an archaeologist, we now also have ditches that we can show are later than a 4th century ditch, again, which suggests we have post-Roman activity on the site. So anyway, so thank you for listening to me. I'll stop my share. There we go. We've learned lots about the site from excavation. We've learned lots about people doing the excavation. We've been able to demonstrate that the great British public are actually very capable at digging, and there's a great market and enthusiasm for it. And I think the great thing is that over the years, we've managed to engage with hundreds of people from Irchester, Wellingborough, and around. I mean, we have had people from quite a long distance coming to take part, because it is quite a unique opportunity in terms